I'm so sorry I can't join your discussion this morning. The most important challenge facing education systems all around the world is not to design reforms, but to make them happen successfully. And let's be clear, it's becoming more difficult every day simply because the demands on education are changing so rapidly. Education used to be about teaching people something that was easy to organize for governments. But now education is about helping students develop a reliable compass and the navigation skills to find their own way through an increasingly uncertain, volatile, and ambiguous world. These days we simply no longer know how things will unfold. Often we are surprised, and we need to learn from the extraordinary. And sometimes we make mistakes along the way. But it will often be the mistakes and failures, when properly understood, that create the context for learning and growth. That's true for students, it's true for teachers, and it's true for education policy. The dilemma for educators is that the kind of skills that are easiest to teach and easiest to test are also the skills that are easiest to digitize, automate, and outsource. You can solve large parts of today's schoolwork in seconds with the help of a smartphone. If we want our children to become smarter than a smartphone, we need to look much harder at what we teach and how we teach. This isn't just about robots taking over whole factories. You can have a car driving for 1 million miles through the dense traffic of Copenhagen without an accident. What will this do to thousands of car and taxi drivers tomorrow? Or think about augmented reality. You can integrate the world's most advanced knowledge into what you do in real time, and that means the world no longer rewards people just for what they know. Google knows everything, but for what they can do with what they know. And there is a lot more to come. Or think about some of the social challenges. Everyone wants to live in your country. Our world is becoming far more diverse, and that means classrooms are becoming far more diverse, and we expect teachers to embrace that diversity with an ever wider repertoire of pedagogic strategies. All that means we need to think harder how we design, implement, scale, and spread good ideas. And to think harder how to use the people, the spaces, the time, and the technology in education to prepare the next generation for their future rather than our own past. I know, easy to say, hard to do. We all know that the road to education reform is just littered with good ideas that are poorly implemented. So what it's going to take? The past was about delivered wisdom. The future is about user-generated wisdom. The past was divided. You had teachers and content divided by subjects and student destinations. And the past was isolated. Schools were designed to keep students inside and the rest of the world outside. Well, the future needs to be much more integrated. And that means emphasizing integration of subjects, integration of students, and integration of learning contexts. And it needs to be connected. That means connected with the real-world contexts, and also open to the rich resources in our communities. Instruction in the past was subject-based. And the instruction in the future will be a lot more project-based. The past was hierarchical. Students were recipients and teachers the dominant resource. The future is co-created. And that means we need to recognize both students and adults as resources for the co-creation of communities, for the design of learning, and for the success of students. The future also needs to be collaborative. And that means changing working norms. And I know from Denmark how hard this is. In the past, different students were taught in similar ways. Now we need to embrace diversity with differentiated pedagogical practices. The past was curriculum-centered. The future is learner-centered. The goals of the past were standardization and compliance. That is, students are educated in batches of age, following the same standard curriculum, all assessed at the same time. The future is about building instruction from student passions and capacities, helping students personalize their learning and assessment in ways that foster engagement and talents. In the past, schools were technological islands. That is, technology was deployed mostly to support existing practice, mainly for efficiency gains. Future schools are empowered, use the potential of technologies to liberate learning from past conventions and connect learners in new and powerful ways. The past was interactive. The future is participative. And finally, powerful learning environments are constantly creating synergies and constantly finding new ways to enhance professional, social, cultural capital. And they do that with families and communities, with higher education, with business, and especially with other schools and learning environments. The challenge is that this kind of system transformation cannot be mandated by government. That just leads to surface compliance. It also can't be solely built from the ground. Success is about building ecosystems that bring those worlds together. And all of that means education policy in itself needs to become more innovative. And I'm glad you have put that so centrally on the agenda for this dialogue. Governments can't do the innovations in the classroom, but they can create an innovation-friendly climate where transformative ideas can bloom at the grassroots level. And they can do that both by fostering innovation within the system, but also by creating opportunities for outside innovations to better enter the system. Governments can also make great ideas real, strengthen professional autonomy and a collaborative culture where great ideas are shared, refined, borrowed, and where access to funding and non-financial support lifts those ideas into action. Not least, governments can build incentives and signals that strengthen the visibility and demand for what actually works. And governments can find better ways to recognize, reward, and give exposure to success. Make it easier for innovators to take risks, encourage the emergence of new actors. So how can we make that happen? A shared vision and clear and consistent priorities that extend across governments and across time, that is so important. And so are ambition and a sense of urgency and the capacity to learn and to adapt for reform. Performance management is essential, and that includes appropriate targets, good real-time data, regular monitoring, incentives to reward success aligned to those targets. Nothing will work without investing in frontline capacity. This is about building professional capabilities, transferring and sharing best practices and innovation, and managing human resources flexibly. You know that better than anyone. Last but not least, it all needs to fit together in a good delivery architecture. And that includes strong leadership at every level of the system, including teacher leadership, and consistent focus and prioritization. Education reform is always difficult. Everyone supports education reform except for their own children. Everyone has participated in education, so everyone has an opinion about it. Implementation is difficult to coordinate across the various levels of the administration and across multiple regional and local jurisdictions. And the fear of loss of privileges matters a lot in education reform, simply because the vast structure of established providers implies extensive vested interests. So it's no surprise that lots of stakeholders will do everything to maintain the status quo. But education can and should do better. Both the lack of coherence in reform efforts across successive governments and the fact that just 1 in 10 reform makes any serious attempt to gauge impact, that is inexcusable and a sign of a lack of respect for both taxpayers and educators. There are some basic features of education reforms that students, parents, and educators should be able to take for granted. Those include clarity about purpose, and also about intended outcomes at every level of the system. They also include clarity about methods and delivery. Reform should also include inbuilt means of public accountability, that is, transparency of when and how judgments are going to be made as to whether reform implementation is on track. and what the contingency plans are when the intended results do not materialize. Last but not least, there needs to be clarity about the actors involved in implementation and their relationships through which intended reforms are going to translate into implemented reforms and ultimately achieved reforms. In following education reform over the last 20 years, I've drawn kind of 6 lessons on policy implementation. The first is to strive for consensus about the aims of reform, without compromising the drive for improvement, of course. And that means acknowledging divergent views and interests. You can never over-communicate. And you can significantly reduce the likelihood of strong opposition through feedback that allows legitimate concerns to be taken into account. Involvement of stakeholders cultivates a sense of joint ownership, and hence also build consensus over both the need and the relevance of reforms. Mechanisms of regular and institutionalized consultation can contribute to the development of trust among parties and help them reach consensus. I think Denmark's Council for Evaluation and Quality Development actually is a good example for how you can assemble government, unions, parents, principals around something even as controversial as evaluation. Finally, external pressures can build a compelling case for change. The second lesson is to engage teachers not just in the implementation of reform, but in their design. Policy can encourage that through leadership development strategies that create and sustain learning communities, by building indicators of professional learning and into processes of school inspection and accreditation, by linking evidence of commitment to professional learning to performance-related pay, and to measures of teacher competence used in recertification, by providing seed money for self-learning in schools and among schools, by professional self-regulation through processes and organizations that include teachers. Certainly, Sweden is a great country to learn from in this respect. Policy experimentation can help build consensus on implementation and can prove powerful in testing out policy initiatives, and because they have a limited scope, overcome fears and resistance. Backing reforms with sustainable resources is always central. It's about money, of course, but it's more importantly about professional capacity and support. Timing and sequencing. We need to acknowledge that it is rarely possible to predict clear and identify links between policies and outcomes, especially given the lag involved between the time at which the initial cost of reform is incurred and the time when it is evident whether the intended benefits of reforms are actually materializing. No? Everyone needs to be realistic about their expectations, about the pace and nature of reforms. And that's very, very hard in the heat of the debate, of course. Time is also needed to learn about and understand the impact of reform measures, to build trust and to develop the necessary capacity to move on to the next stage of policy development. And last but not least, success is about building partnerships with education unions and to design and implement reforms. Putting the teaching profession at the heart of education reform requires a strong and fruitful dialogue between governments and unions. Teachers should not just be part of the implementation of reforms, but must become part of their design. And conflict isn't best addressed by weak unions, but by really strong social partnership. All that is easy to say, hard to do. I said this already. The Americans say, yes, we can. That's a good start, but even that doesn't mean things actually get done. The Europeans say too often, yes, we should. It's never enough. The Chinese don't say anything, they just do it.